Well, good morning and thank you all for coming. I'm so pleased this morning to introduce our guest speaker, who is Nathan Harrington. And as Shirley said, sort of continuing a theme about environmental racism and what is happening in particular in Ward 8 with trying to bring what had once been vibrant parks back to life, to usable life. So yesterday, about 8 of us went over to the Kenilworth Park Earth Day cleanup, and it was a very interesting experience. One of the shocking, I shouldn't be shocked, but I am. The gentleman said that of all of the trash that's picked up, 60% of it is plastic bottles. It was just a stunning thing to think about the overwhelming majority of the trash that we have is plastic bottles. I also want to introduce another guest that we have. Eric Whitaker is here this morning, and so we're just blessed to have new people in our midst. So Nathan, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
And thank you for having me. I want to start off just by saying that I'm really sad this morning, and that's because found out about a week ago that my 19-year-old nephew is dying of cancer. He's had cancer since he was like 10 years old, but up until now, the treatments have worked and he's recovered. And now we find he's been going through this really terrible chemo the last 6 months and it did not work at all. So, and they don't know of anything else that might work.
What is his name?
Thomas Harrington, yeah.
Okay.
And his father, who's my older brother, died 1.5 years ago. Very suddenly, like unexpected heart attack. So it's just sort of, grief compounding grief.
Well, let me just say Nathan will certainly hold you and your family in our prayers.
Just a little bit more about me. I was born in DC, and my family is Quaker. Actually, my grandfather on my mom's side moved here in 1938 for a job with American Friends Service Committee. Both of my family on both sides had roots in Pennsylvania, the Quakers and the Pennsylvania Dutch. I grew up in Rockville, Maryland, and Sandy Spring Friends Meeting, which is one of the historic Quaker communities in Maryland. I went to Bates College in Maine, and then for 11 years, I was a middle school and high school history teacher. And that was a whole sort of odyssey that, I could write a book about, bearing, I think, some similarities to some of the movies that you may have seen about teachers in the inner city and all of that nonsense. But I eventually was really, I could say that I wanted to switch careers, but the truth is at the time I did not. I was forced out of teaching through multiple firings for multiple school systems, and that's part of the odyssey that I might write about someday. But I was really at loose ends for a while. I was like, I know that I have to come up with a new career, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And I was the manager of a farmer's market for a while. And, going back to when I was teaching, I bought a house. I was more or less kind of a typical gentrifier who is gay and doesn't have any kids and likes, quaint old houses and, wanted to buy something that I could afford on a teacher's salary. So I bought a house in Congress Heights, which is in Ward 8, for anyone that doesn't know. DC is divided into 8. It's a political division. Each ward elects a council member. For the portion of DC that's east of the Anacoastal River, Ward 7 basically is the north half of that. Ward 8 is the south half. And I was looking for ways to sort of decompress when I wasn't teaching. One of the things I didn't like about it was that I was, stuck in these like poorly ventilated buildings all day. So when I wasn't working, I was checking out the woods, and one of the things that I liked about Ward 8 was that we had a lot of I grew up going to Quaker camp and Boy Scouts, so I had kind of a familiarity with and a comfort level with being in the woods. It was kind of my happy place. And so I would be hiking and running, and one of the weird things was that there were not a lot of trails. So you would have big tracts of land, hundreds of acres, But if you wanted to actually go for a walk, you had to like fight your way through thorns and fallen trees, and it was kind of a mess, to be honest with you. And the more literal mess in that there was just thousands and thousands of pounds of trash. Wherever the woods were bordering the street, there was just so much trash. So I started kind of picking up trash by myself. It's like, instead of, trying to run or hike through these woods that are all overgrown, like, I'll just bag up trash. So I started doing that kind of, for fun, I guess. I'm kind of obsessive compulsive, so I found it like really satisfying to just sort of do something that, where the results were immediately visible. And then got the blessing of the Congress Heights Neighborhood Association, recruited a few other people in the neighborhood to make a committee, and we started having monthly cleanup events, which that tradition continues every second Saturday with the Shepherd Parkway Community Cleanup. But during those cleanups, people who lived, in the neighborhood where we were cleaning would often stop and thank us for what we were doing. And then the question oftentimes would be, are you hiring? And for the longest time, I would say, well, no, we wish we could, but we don't have any money. And, so if you want to help, you can volunteer. And then the response to that would often be, well, I wish I could, but I need a job. I need income. I have bills to pay. My family is going to be really mad if they find out I'm working for free. It's not going to work for them. So eventually I kind of put two and two together and said, if we want to get more people involved, we need to meet them where they are. And their most basic need is for work. On top of that, a lot of these guys, I found out, have trouble getting jobs because of criminal records, or what we call returning citizens. Some of them didn't finish high school. Some of them have big gaps in their resume. And so they want to work, but they have trouble. So that led to the idea of, we're going to create a green jobs program. We have all these people who need work. We have all of this work that needs doing. If we can get some money, we can sort of stick those two problems together and create a solution. So it started in 2018 with a grant from DC Department of the Environment, an existing nonprofit organization. Anacoastal River was the fiscal sponsor. They provided some of the administrative support. We advertised what we call park steward positions to be half-time. At the time, the starting pay, I think, was $17 an hour. It's since moved up to 20. And we got over 100 applicants. And ever since, in the almost 5 years since, there's always been more applicants than we could hire. People always asking about jobs. So what are well, first of all, I should say a little bit more about the woods themselves. Do you have our website there? So if you go to the tab at the top that says The Woods, there is a page for each one of, go to Fort Stanton. Yeah. So during the Civil War, at the start of the Civil War, the Union Army realized that DC was really vulnerable to possible Confederate invasion. So they seized a lot of land that were on hilltops in a ring around the city, and they built these earthwork forts. Fort Stevens, which is off of Georgia Avenue, actually had a battle where the Confederates attacked and were pushed back. The rest of these forts basically were used as a deterrent. They were used for training. People who were escaping slavery on plantations in Maryland and Virginia came to DC, where slavery had been abolished earlier. We just celebrated DC Emancipation Day, which marks that event. And they were looking for sort of protection and employment with the Union Army. So there were freedmen communities that sprung up around a lot of these forts. And then after the war, they kind of went back to nature. Some of them were given back to their original owners. But by that time, the tobacco economy had collapsed, so they weren't really going to be used for farming anymore. Until 1902, the Senate Park Commission under Senator McMillan of Michigan came up with this plan, for a park network throughout the state. And one component of that was what they called the Fort Circle. They wanted to take the locations of those forts with wooded parkland surrounding and make a greenway all the way around the city. Originally, they wanted to have a parkway. So in the 19 teens, 20s, 30s, they acquired thousands and thousands of acres of parkland for that purpose. And
The they is the federal government.
yes, National Park Service specifically. But you know, at the same time, the city was really growing. There was a lot of development pressure, so they were not able to attain all the land that they needed. Eventually, they ran out of money and sort of political will, so they never finished it. But east of the Anacostia is sort of a sampler of what the vision was. There's like a 6.5 mile greenway that starts at Fort Stanton Park. Can you scroll down a little bit? There should be some more pictures on the right. Oh, if you click on those, it should get bigger. Over here. So this shows the locations of some of the forts back during the Civil War. Anyway, so and then I think in the 1960s, they actually did create a natural surface foot trail that goes along the whole 6.5 miles of that. So that's cool. But they also acquired further south Shepherd Parkway was a 208 acre parcel of land that later in the 1960s, when they built Interstate 295, it became sort of a buffer between the highway at the bottom of the hill and the neighborhoods at the top of the hill. But the Park Service, the DC government, the local trail club, nobody ever bothered to build any trails or put up any signs to tell people that this was federal parkland. It was land that was just kind of there. If you talk to some of the older residents, they will tell you that they used to play and explore down there, but anyone who is has grown up in the last 40 years or so will probably say, no, we don't go down there. It's overgrown, it's dirty, it's dangerous. The same goes for really all the wooded areas in Ward 8. There's also Suitland Parkway, which was built also during World War II, I should say, for the specific purpose of connecting Bowling Air Force Base with Andrews Air Force Base. It was built through a natural valley, and they set aside about 100 acres of woods along their side, which was eventually transferred to DC Department of Transportation, which is a transportation agency, not a land management agency, not a parks and recreation agency. So they basically just let the land sit there. And a few years ago, when we came to them with a proposal to build a trail, they said, no, that's not what we do. We only maintain like commuter infrastructure, and natural surface trails are for recreation, not for commuting. Which actually brings up sort of a confusion as to what's meant by the word trail. Because the DC government has spent many millions in recent years on developing bike trails. There's a Capital Trails Coalition, but those projects explicitly are limited to paved trails, those that are used primarily for biking. And there has been no move to create natural surface trails, even though they're much cheaper to build and have a much lesser environmental impact. Most of the trails that we have, say in Rock Creek Park, were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. There were a couple that were added in the 60s and 70s, during the sort of the course of the environmental movement that we have now and the initiation of the first Earth Day and all of that. But really, it's been about 50 years since any natural surface trails were built, at least in DC. And so there's no institutional knowledge in the Park Service or DC government about how, or even Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. They do a great job of maintaining existing trails from DC to Shenandoah and beyond, but they have very little experience building brand new trails. So you have something that should have been done 100 years ago. It never was, and now we're sort of locked into this situation where because the Park Service is underfunded and they have they're very bureaucratic. Their focus is on complying with rules and regulations. So they'll say, oh, well, if you want to build a trail, you have to study the environmental impact first, and you have to do an archaeological study, and you can't even plant trees without doing all of which is sort of prohibitively expensive. And so we're essentially with these trail proposals, we have one for Shepherd Parkway and one for Suitland Parkway. We're just trying to give east of the river neighborhoods the same sort of amenities and access to their public land that has already existed in other parts of the city for decades. But that is proving to be much more difficult politically than you would expect. The main focus of the Park Stewards program over the last almost 5 years has been remediating, trying to undo the neglect, specifically with respect to trash and invasive species. So the first thing is just littering. You know, we have a consumer economy where almost everything you buy comes with disposable packaging, stuff that exists for you to get the product, but as soon as you open it up, it goes in the trash. It's supposed to go away. But where is away? Everything's connected, right? Recycling plastic is not very economical. The US used to send most of its used plastic to China. But the process of melting it down and recycling it was so polluting that they decided they weren't going to do it anymore. So a lot of the plastic that is, you know, sorted and packaged for recycling is actually sitting over the Senate. And the recycling rate in DC for last year was 6.5%. So the vast majority of it for plastic specific. In a best case scenario, it's basically going to a landfill. And in a worst case scenario, people are just throwing it out the window and onto the ground. And of course, it's light, it can blow in the wind, it can float. So every time it rains, every water bottle or snack wrapper that is in the gutter gets walked down into the storm drains, and from there to the Anacoastal River, the Chesapeake, and the ocean. But beyond just littering, and I should say about littering, you know, there hasn't actually been that much research on it, but what we do know is, for one thing, people tend to litter when they see litter. So if you go to a place where the ground is already covered in trash, you're like, already covered in trash. If I add a few things, it's not going to make any difference. The other thing is people tend to litter when they feel a lack of power or control in the space where they are. So people who own property are less likely to throw trash near the property that they own, because they have a literal and figurative investment in it. If they're smart, they realize that trash on or near their property diminishes their property value, etc. But for people who don't have that ownership stake, people who are in a survival mode, just trying to get through the day, where you know what you do with your trash is really not on the agenda of things that they're going to worry about, and that causes people to just throw it out. They may think that it's somebody else's job to take care of it, and there's a contradiction inherent in that, because I just said that people litter less when the litter is cleaned up. So one way to prevent litter is to just constantly clean it up so people don't see it all the time. But there may be a degree to which when people see other people cleaning it up, they may think, well, I can throw it because next week somebody's going to. So I don't know how to resolve that dilemma. Somehow those things are both true at once. And then beyond just littering, we have dumping of large items. Tires are a big problem. Right around Christmas time, Ward 8 Woods made the news because we encountered a pile of more than 3,000 tires that someone had dumped from a 395 interpass into kind of a remote area of Anacoastal Park, where apparently nobody saw it or reported it until me. And so that's illustrative of the fact that shock value is necessary in order to get media attention. The other thing that we got attention for lately was cars in the woods. It's got to be big and shocking and strange in order for people to pay attention to it, which is too bad, but that's how it goes. Tires are expensive and inconvenient to deal with. Most of DC's trash goes to an incinerator in Northern Virginia. Tires cannot be burned in an incinerator, they're too toxic. Landfills don't really want them because they take up too much space, they don't come back easily. And there's basically only one recycling facility within 100 miles of here that can actually deal with them properly, and it's in Baltimore, and it's not big enough to handle all of the scrap tires that are being generated from that metro area and this one. So, you know, when you buy a new tire, the shop charges you a fee, then they're supposed to pay that fee to the recycler. But what seems to be happening is that some of them will hire a private hauler, no questions asked. The hauler will take the money, keep all of it, and dump the tires in the woods somewhere where they think nobody's paying attention or where they can get away with it. And for decades, that somewhere has been public parkland east of the river. Yeah.
Would it help for all of us when you get new tires and you pay that fee at a dealer to say, what happens to this tire now that I paid you this money, and just see if they,
Yeah.
I mean, I presume some of them will lie to us, but I would just suggest that you kind of take that on as an extra step, because you're paying for recycling fees. Like
Yeah.
that, when they take the battery out of the car, pay a fee for them to supposedly recycle.
Right. Yeah, that's a great idea.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I have asked that some of them tell me they don't know. Or they say, oh, I give it to so and so. But they don't know where so and so is taking. So it's not the shop, it's like a middleman hauler. There's supposed to be a middleman between the tire shop and the tire recycler. But they're leaving the recycler out of it and just dumping it illegally. Yeah.
What is supposed to happen to the tire once it gets to the right place?
They are usually shredded into very small pieces and used to make permeable pavement. For playgrounds, it's good because you can fall on it and not get hurt, and it allows water to percolate. So it's good for, stormwater runoff. We're actually advocating that a new facility for that be created in or close to DC. And that, that DPW, I'm not sure how it would work, but clearly we need more capacity for that. And ultimately, we need to start making tires out of something that's like biodegradable. You can do it using soy and other things. Construction materials are another source of trash. As neighborhoods east of the river gentrify, you have a lot of old houses that are being renovated. Some of the contractors who are doing that work are coming in from the outside. They don't have any connection to the community. They don't, maybe they're small. They don't have a lot of extra people or profit margin. So instead of driving it to the dump and paying, they will throw stuff, in the woods at the end of the block where they're working. And again, knowing that they're not going to get caught and that other people have done it and can do it. So that kind of sends a message that it's acceptable. We have a lot of apartment complexes that don't have adequate waste disposal. You may not know, in DC, we have sort of an unusual system where any property with more than 4 units, really, anything that's more than like a duplex or a triplex, the city doesn't collect the trash for you. It's up to the landlord or the property manager to contract with a private hauler. And that's a major expense for them. A lot of them try to save by having not enough dumpsters, or a dumpster that's only emptied once a week, when really it needs to be like 3 times as big and emptied twice a week. But lacking that, trash will pile up next to the dumpster. It'll attract bugs, it'll attract mice and rats, and residents will say to themselves, well, since our landlord's basically not giving us anywhere to put it, I might as well throw it over the fence into those woods over there, because nobody's using those woods anyway, and it's like more sort of out of sight and out of mind than if I put it next to the dumpster. So we've tried to identify some of those problem areas, talk to the landlords and the managers. Most of them don't want to acknowledge the problem or take any responsibility for it. They just blame the tenants and say, hey, we can't control what they do. We are lobbying for a bill that's before the DC Council that would kind of set minimum requirements for the number of cubic feet that they would have to have. And the frequency with which they would be emptied, and hire more sanitation inspectors to actually go out and enforce that. Because the other problem is DC Public Works doesn't, and this is true with many of our environmental laws, as strong as some of them are, they aren't enforced proactively. The city waits for people to go on 311 and submit a complaint. And, in some neighborhoods and buildings, you have, busybody, neighborhood activist people who are paying attention to that stuff and going and submitting requests all the time. And in other places you don't. So in places that don't have that kind of hyper local activism, or residents who feel like empowered to take on that type of thing, don't get the service, and that reinforces inequality in the type of service that different networks will state. So we're trying to lobby to change that. What else? We are starting to see, really just in the last few months, serious issues with deforestation. So most of the parkland in east of the river is within the national park system. As I mentioned, they are grossly under budgeted and understaffed. They don't have the resources to deal with illegal dumping. They don't have the resources to build or maintain trails. They rely basically on partner organizations and volunteers to do all of that. And they push back on anything that they think is going to cost them money or resources in the future. But good thing you can say about the Park Service is once land is entrusted to their care, they hang on to it. They don't just give it away to developers the way the DC government. And yet, even there, Shepherd Parkway, I said, was 205 acres. A few years ago, the Department of General Services seized 8 acres to build a new entrance ramp, the new Homeland Security campus. So 8 acres of what was federal parkland. It was a historic Civil War site that had been in the national park system for 90 years, just leveled. Used to make a road that so far nobody seems to be using. So that's very discouraging. And then you have all this other land, you have land that belongs to the city. And like I said, DC government is very susceptible to political pressure and sort of inside dealing amongst people who are well connected. So I mentioned the Homeland Security campus. That's the west side of the historic St. Elizabeth's campus. The east side of that is being redeveloped by DC government, and it's like 70 some acres. There was a portion, maybe 10 acres along one side of the campus that was a wooded stream valley. And some of the early planning documents for the redevelopment indicated that that was going to be set aside as parkland, and maybe there would be some trails. But at some point, a developer came along and said, no, actually, we want to cut a street through here from Alabama Avenue to Suitland Parkway. We want to have a parking garage and some condos, and it's all going to be right there in that stream valley. So a couple of months ago, I was walking my dog over there, and totally like 5 acres, just like hundreds of trees, and the stream that was there buried inside a concrete pipe. It was like, that's the kind of stuff that was done a lot in the early and mid 20th century. We didn't have an understanding of how watersheds work and, the importance of urban forests. And yet it's still happening in cases where it's like profitable and politically expedient to do that. And then we have land so that's district owned land. It's happened on federal land. And then you have private land, some of which is bordering public parkland. And so you sort of look at it like, it looks like it's part of the park. But unless you study online records, you don't realize that there's like an invisible line going through the woods that separates the actual public parkland from a lot that's owned by an investor. And next thing you know, that investor sells to a developer and they cut down all the trees that were on that lot. And DC does have laws that are stronger than most places. If you are going to cut down trees, you have to have a permit. And if the tree is more than 44 inches in diameter, it's considered a special tree. And you have to pay fees that are then used to plant new trees. But in an urban area, we're sort of running out of space for new trees, and not all of the ones that are planted are going to survive. And the ones that do survive, it's going to be 50 or 100 years before they get to be 44 inches in diameter. At which point they'll be able to soak up as much water and filter as much air as the trees that would come down. So there's really, tree planting is great, but it's not a substitute for preserving the matured forest that we already have. Just one more thing I need to highlight. A big part of what we do is invasive vines. So, every ecosystem sort of includes all of these plant and animal and fungi species that have evolved together over millions of years, and they're sort of in balance. But then when you take a plant from another part of the world and introduce it here, it can really disrupt that balance. So English ivy, for example, is native throughout Europe. It was introduced as an ornamental because it has these spade-shaped leaves that stay green all winter and they grow up buildings, you know, and it looks like Harvard and all this. But when they escape into the Ivy League, right? But when it escapes into the woods, it wreaks havoc. The trees don't know how to respond to it. It grows faster than the tree. It can eventually basically cover the canopy of the tree, block it from collecting light, photosynthesizing, and kill them. So we have thousands of trees, actually, I mean, just in Ward 8 that have already been killed in that way, and 4,000 that we've been able to save so far. Simply by, and it's not a permanent solution, the vines do grow back, unless you spray with pesticides, which is a whole other dilemma. But at least, you know, if the vines have been growing for 30 years, we cut them to the ground, it's gonna be, that buys us another 30 years before the tree is gonna be imperiled again. And that's just one example. There's 5 or 6 major ones that we have to contend with. Another just dilemma I should highlight has to do with gentrification and displacement. So throughout the last, 30 years at least, there's this pattern of, neighborhoods that were neglected, ones that suffered divestment where the property values were really low. And then you have people like me who say, hey, you can get a nice house for not very much. You have developers who can say, hey, we can redevelop this historic building or put up a new one. And, there's demand because those other neighborhoods, that were affordable are now expensive. So you have other people who are looking for housing in a lower price range, and this is where they can do it. And that, that process leads to lower income people being priced out and having to leave. And obviously there's a racial element to that, where most of the people being displaced are Black and most of the new people coming in are not. And so some people are concerned that really any effort to improve quality of life or to make an area more desirable has the potential to contribute to that. So everybody deserves nice parks and clean air. Everybody deserves to be safe, to go to good schools. But by doing those things, are we inadvertently contributing to people being displaced? And if so, how do we compensate for that? So Ward 8 Woods is not a housing organization, but we do, it's really important to me that we sort of lend our voices to housing justice organizations that are working to preserve and renovate public housing, housing cooperatives. There's a new land trust that is trying to create affordable housing in suburban. And then there's a new organization called the Center for Social Housing and Public Investment that is putting forward the idea of use social housing like what they do in Europe, where we look at housing as infrastructure. The same way, the same way we build roads and water systems, we need to build housing for working people. So I could go on forever, but I'll stop there. Yeah, let's talk. Yeah.
Do you deal with graffiti at all?
No. As a matter of fact, I happen to be kind of a fan of street art. I think, well, I'm a fan of hip hop music, and historically there's a strong association between the music and the artwork. I think sometimes if you have a concrete wall that's totally blank, painting something on it can actually make it more beautiful. But it's by the history and the tradition of street art is that it's illegal and unsanctioned, and obviously that creates issues. You guys know beech trees, and they're like smooth, really smooth bark. People like to carve stuff. And that's another thing where it's like, yeah, you're hurting the tree, and it's like, when you're in nature, you're supposed to leave no trace. But I'm also a big believer in sort of like nature is not separate from people, it's shaped by people. And when people add like their mark on nature, maybe there's something kind of cool about that. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, DC government does have a program to get rid of graffiti that's done illegally, and then they have a mural program that's supposed to get street artists to like do their art in a way that's sanctioned. Yeah.
We have a culvert that comes into our neighborhood park And it's got sort of wings on it, and I noticed graffiti there, and I just decided, instead of trying to go through procedures, I took a picture of the bare concrete, went to Home Depot, matched the picture, got some concrete deck paint that was the color of natural concrete. And I just figured my contribution to street art is I'm gonna make this a blank wall again.
Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to ask two questions. One is, rightly so, you know, you're painting a pretty dark picture, right, of what's going on. What do you feel optimistic about? Or is there, in all that you shared with us, are there places that you really are see hope and things that you're excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic because we've removed 1.1 million pounds.
Over what period? Over 5 years?
Yeah, a little less than 5 years. And you know, it's depressing to look at areas.
So that's 200,000, is that right? 200,000 pounds a year, would that be right?
Yeah, something like that.
Oh,
Yeah. And you know, it's depressing to see areas where you clean and then, you know, a month or two later it's trashed again, but there are also, you know, a lot of what we're removing is what we call legacy trash, stuff that's been there. You can tell that it's been there for decades. I mean, antiques almost. We found just yesterday, we found a newspaper box and like sort of perfectly preserved inside the glass panels of the box was the Washington Post from 1980.
Oh,
Yeah.
my God.
So that's a 43-year-old artifact right there. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was very good talk to you. I'm sorry, what's your name, sir?
Nathan.
My name is Christy White, and I just wanted to know what's happening in Washington DC, because I see whenever I go to some streets, suddenly the stores are getting emptied, or whenever I go to some residential area, some of the houses are getting immediately vacated. And where are the people going? What's happening? And what's all this? The people are getting displaced in the businesses, in the residential areas.
My understanding is that a lot of the businesses that are near office areas, like business district areas where they rely on office workers for their business, are suffering and closing because a lot of people aren't going to the office anymore, or at least not every day. And then in some places, the part of the process of gentrification involves old businesses being closed and becoming vacant for a while because the rent is too high. So the rent is too high for existing businesses to stay, but the new businesses haven't come along.
I know Shirley is gonna want us to wrap up in a few minutes so we can get upstairs, but I just.
Could you get the comment on there? We get one from our Zoom consultant.
I'm
sorry.
I have to say, okay, if I may say, this is where unfortunately we're going to have to end.
Oh, okay.
I'm having the comment. that is read on
Just in the
screen.
middle.
Right, we're going to have the comment be the last thing. There are questions still, and I'm going to ask the people to talk individually with our speaker if we can, but Nancy, it would be entirely appropriate.
Okay, it says, sorry for blocking your way. It says, thank you for your work and advocacy. Your work is inspiring for our neighborhood equity that one day may be reached. Okay, that sums it up,
So,
doesn't it?
applause, please.
We'll visit our website. There's a lot of, you know, I'm kind of a writer and a history guy, so there's a lot of text and background information there. You can register for our volunteer events. You can join our mailing list, which we will not spam you. I'm very proud of the fact that I send out one email a month, which is I put all the information in one big email, and of course you can.
Yes.
And the website is ward8woods.org.